Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining THBD's March Lunch and Learn webinar. Today, we're really excited to welcome Dr. Kate Stephenson, owner and founder of Dyad Engineering. Based on her 20 years of developing new products, today she's going to discuss the uses of 3D printing along the entire spectrum of product development. Rather than looking at the technology as a one-size-fits-all miracle manufacturing method, she's going to emphasize the many unique places it has been used most effectively. Kate, I want to thank you so much for joining us today on behalf of the entire THBD team. And before I hand it over, I'd just like to ask that all of our attendees submit any questions you may have in the control panel of your screen under the Questions tab. We'll be sure to address those during the presentation. And with that being said, Kate, feel free to take it away.
All right, thank you very much. And thank you, Temple Health and Bioscience District, for this great opportunity. I love the fact that hosting these lunch and learns is one of the many benefits that you offer, not only to your local group, but extended and web-wide right now. I think we do have attendees from coast to coast right now listening in on today's lunch and learn. So I wanted to give a quick introduction. So in addition to being the founder of Dyad Engineering, I've Stanford Mechanical Engineering PhD, 20 years of engineering, 15 of that has been in medical device. I've also a fourth generation machinist. Much of what I do as far as innovation, medical device, really looks at the fundamental manufacturing technologies that end up eventually making these products. And so right now, in addition to running my consulting firm, I'm also doing a lot of teaching, educating authors, nerding out over factory tours whenever I get the chance, and also running a small zoo out of my house, including 2 grade school boys. So why I give this talk? Given my machining and my manufacturing background, I have some very deep emotional feelings about tools. And eventually, ultimately, that is what 3D printing is. It's an amazing tool. And I hate to see amazing, brilliant tools being treated in bad ways. Now, that can be using a tool in a way it's not meant to be used, or 2, not using a tool when it should be used. So what am I talking about? So I gave a similar talk about 3 or 4 years ago. And I mentioned that one of the things I love to do whenever I'm trying to get a general view of what the public thinks of my industry and the work that I do is to do a Google image search and then take a screenshot. So this was the screenshot I took in May of 2017 by Google doing an image search for medical 3D printing. And about 3 days ago, I did this again, and this is what I got. And the funny thing is, we're still printing a lot of the same things. When you see the images out there on the web, you still see anatomy models, you see high-end orthopedics, you see cool-looking 3D renderings. About the only thing that's really changed in the public perception of 3D printing is things are getting shinier, prettier, tighter tolerances, but really looking at how we're applying it has not changed as much. Now, for those of you actually listening in on this webinar, I'm assuming we have a lot of entrepreneurs and innovators. And for you to be able to really use this tool properly, you need to see the whole picture of all the ways that this is being used in industry right now. So for those of you who are still a little unclear on 3D printing itself, it's a popular term, it's been used a lot. The definition may not be that clear. Basically, it refers to a whole variety of processes used to create a 3-dimensional object by building layers of a material, usually distributed by a computer-controlled robotic system. You start off with a 3D computer model. That computer model is transformed into a set of code operations that are sent to a robot that then produces a material, moves a laser around, does different operations that slowly build up a part piece by piece. And emphasizing the part that that term actually can refer to many different processes. All of them in common is that they slowly, gradually build up layer and layer to build a 3-dimensional object. So 3D printing can be done in vats of liquid, they can be done in buckets of powder. We have different methods that involve pasting sheets together. We have almost every material imaginable that has been converted over into 3D printing. That has been a major change just in the last 5 years. Now we're not looking at just 1 or 2 metals, we're now looking at dozens of specific alloys that have been formulated specifically for 3D printing. We're seeing resins with all kinds of properties. We were able to stimulate almost every plastic imaginable. And we're seeing a lot of additional thermal things are happening as far as working with ceramics, glasses, and other products. So 3D printing is really a whole idea of how you go about creating a part, not necessarily focused on a particular material or a particular method. So generally, if you talk about this in professional industry, the overall term for all these processes is referred to additive manufacturing. It's also been called rapid prototyping or digital manufacturing. There's actually been fluctuating vocabulary over the last 30 years. So 3D printing and additive manufacturing, because it got so popular about the first few years into the year after the year 2000, they've almost become synonyms between 3D printing and additive manufacturing. If you want to know more, you can go to my company's website. I actually posted a blog called What's in a Name that refers to some of the history of these vocabulary terms. Now, here's another chart that some of you may be very, very familiar with. This is the US process for new medical devices. We have discovery and ideation, we have invention and prototyping, we have preclinical, clinical, regulatory decisions, product launch, and post-market monitoring. So when I look at manufacturing processes, I look at how they can affect this entire spectrum, this entire process, not just what actually goes out the door, manufactured at the end, but really how each one of these stages can be improved by a change or an improvement in a particular technology. And part of the challenge I have with the popular perception of 3D printing is that it's been really limited to a very small number of stages in this whole process. We have looks like models, we have prototyping, we have had some very high profile direct parts, especially in orthopedic. Clinical training, you've probably seen all those wonderful anatomical models that look so great in photos. And we've seen a few other applications such as resource poor locations. There's been things like the e-navel, adaptive hand. We've seen talk about doing 3D printing in military applications or third world countries, but this is really somewhat limited, restricted use of this technology. Now, what I'm talking about is not necessarily saying we need to apply 3D printing to every possible manufacturing application. I love this quote by Matthias Howard. There was an article published about 5 years ago in the Harvard Business Review. The simple fact of the matter, the economics of 3D printing is going to be a pretty unfeasible way to produce most of the parts manufactured today. And that's still true, especially if you come from a manufacturing background and you really understand the sheer scale of the materials and processes that produce the physical stuff that we work with, you realize that what you can actually 3D print is not that much. So instead of looking at it as a substitute for existing manufacturing, we should really look to areas where its unique capabilities complement traditional manufacturing processes. So what do I talk about complement? I'm talking about all the different places in the full spectrum of concept to out the door and afterwards in the medical device development process that you can potentially see this technology adding a lot of value. So some of my teachers would call this what's called an eye chart, lots and lots of text in teeny tiny amounts across a big screen. But I'm going to go into each one of these areas. And so the title of my presentation, I called 10 different ways that 3D printing can apply to medical device manufacturing and development. And that's really these 10 different areas that I'm going to have to really fly through to stay within my time limit here. But so I want to give everyone listening in an opportunity to really think about all the different ways this technology can help across the entire spectrum of where you're working with in medical device or any medical products in general. Starting off from the very beginning, basic research. This is something that a lot of people may not realize is that basic research is actually in many ways a resource poor situation. You have fixed budgets and you have people working in labs trying to create custom fixtures, custom test setup and apparatus that traditionally is very, very expensive. Whether you are working with an in-house machinist at a research facility, whether you are trying to patch this stuff together as a grad student, there are many applications where you can need to 3D print something. It's essentially a easy to use, simple, low volume manufacturing. Now, this has been used in some scale applications. There have been situations where you have highly specialized equipment where just a few molded parts can shoot the price of that equipment up into the 6 figures. But what you can do is if you're only producing 100 of these machines, 200 of these machines, being able to 3D print some of the housing and many of the parts inside that equipment is a very reasonable application. This allows you to keep your equipment costs down below something that a grad student could actually afford in their lab. Now, if you've not heard of this already, I definitely got to put a plug in for the NIH. This is their 3D print exchange. It's been operating for a number of years. This is still the same frontage page they had when I gave this presentation a few years ago. And what they are is they are a huge database of curated files, looking at not only molecular models, anatomy models, different devices, and scientific apparatus. If you have not checked this out, definitely go through, spend some time exploring their database. There's a number of freely available files to download in a printable format that can allow you to have access to a lot of products. The other thing I want to talk about, this was one of my favorite papers that I used in my PhD thesis, why every MRI research group should have a low budget 3D printer. So what they're actually looking at here is custom fixation for animal studies. In this case, they were doing MRI studies of rats in response to different medications. And they really needed a way to comfortably and humanely fixture a rat and hold it very still while they were doing their MRI imaging. And I can actually say that I know of a machinist who actually created these for another lab. And that this simple part, even just a simple nose cone to anesthetize a rat, was running $80 to $100 to machine a simple plastic part. Versus here, this is something that very simply a grad student could produce and print on their own in-house printer. Literally, for the price of 3 nose cones, you could afford to have a printer in your own lab. So moving on to the next stage, concept definition and feasibility. So I'm not talking about prototypes here, I'm talking even before the prototypes. So this includes things like hacking existing solutions. You're not making whole solutions, you're just trying to change a feature or change a screw hole on an existing solution to allow you to test it in a new situation. Some of this is making concepts tangible to improve cross-discipline communication. One thing I learned in my career is that as an engineer and designer, my ability to be imaginative and to imagine the potential of a product is a unique aspect of being a designer and an engineer. When you're working with doctors, nurses, patients, individuals who are very much outside that skill set, you really have to find a way to work with them and to help them to imagine what you're talking about. So for example, when I talk about this is a dementia simulator headset. So creating a test apparatus or set that allows you to go in and recreate a situation, either a patient condition or being able to simulate an experience with a new product is a great way to be able to use 3D printing. So design, definition, and feasibility. This is really one of the areas that we've seen most of the use from. It's where 3D printing really got started. Prototyping solutions. So now it's not just, when I talk about prototyping, I don't just creating wholesale individual parts, trying to simulate a finished product as soon as possible. When we talk about products, we talk about all the different ways you can make a prototype. This includes making multiple types to try and drive a design decision, reducing to practice for patent submissions. Many times patenting becomes one of the very first things you do, and it can be very difficult when it's one of the first things you need to do before you have funding, before you have investors, to be able to really write up a solid patent submission with the level of detail necessary to get it, including bench testing of individual solution elements. A lot of times you don't build the whole thing at once, you have to test all the individual parts. You're going back to its roots, mechanism prototyping, but also the test apparatus that you need to test that prototype. Design integration is a step that, in my experience as working for multiple design firms, ends up getting pushed to the very end. I'm talking about putting electronics into parts. Finally, remote team communications. So looking at low resolution functional models, I tend to share this image. This is my kitchen table when I was working on an actual medical device very, very early on. So this is why I was working at my kitchen table. But also looking at the bottom there, where you need to rapidly create a lot of different shapes that can be held and squeezed and held to drive some of your design decisions. But also looking at the opposite end of the spectrum, especially when you're working with investors or certain types of medical professionals, it's very difficult for it to be real to them, for them to see the value of it, unless they have something that looks like the final object. It doesn't necessarily need to have electronics. It can be completely faked. But 3D printing has gotten to the point that you can create these incredibly beautiful, shiny objects that can really sell some of your vision. And finally, when I'm talking about integrated models, this is where you really need to have solid plastic parts to test the function of your product. This is a suturing tool that was being developed. So you need something that mechanically could hold all those gears together, while at the same time being able to test your code, testing your embedded software. So being able to put all these pieces together before you start investing in things like tooling for injection molding is something that 3D printing is a great thing to have. Moving on to the next stage. Once you have a design, you have to be able to test that design. So design validation. I would say this is one of the most expensive parts of this whole cycle. And it's one of the most dangerous parts because you don't have a solid win yet. You don't have FDA. You're trying to get FDA approval, but you need to have the thing to test the thing. And so creating the really high resolution functional prototypes for cadaver studies, sterilizable prototypes for animal testing. So when I started doing a lot of my medical device design back in 2003, 2004, we really didn't have this kind of capability in 3D printing. I remember a very distinct opportunity when we had 24 animal test prototypes that we sent out. They were SLAs, sent them out for 3D for an SLA, came back, and they had almost completely been destroyed. The plastic was gummy, it was warped. Whatever condition, resins were not validated for different sterilization properties yet. So the fact that even today we have many options, not just one resin, but a dozen different resins or metals or ceramics that we can sterilize. We have autoclavable 3D printable polymers now, which just blows my mind. Looking at test fixtures, test units. If any of you have ever had to look at how many different units you need to pass the full battery of tests for FDA approval, you might start getting a little upset. I ran a study a few years ago for a new catheter product where we needed to do studies for the animal studies, we need first-in-man studies, we needed packaging and sterilization, EMF testing, and all of these different tests. And we were using our carefully crafted engineering devices, which were being assembled by engineers and often took 10 to 20 hours to assemble each one of these devices. Each of these products was several $1,000s because this was all pre-major manufacturing. There was no manufacturing of scale. So literally every test unit, and to get this to the statistical significant, we were looking at hundreds of units. So being able to swap out some 3D printed dummies to do our packaging testing or to do our sterilization validating, where we were only testing the packaging or the seals, that was a major cost saver to us as we were going through our clinical trials. And finally, looking at late stage risk mitigation activities. If you've met somebody who's gone through a few cycles of new medical device production and getting them to market, you'll realize that there will always be something that happens late in the game where that would be very, very expensive to change. Either a way you need to improve your process, a change to a piece of tooling, or a new part that needs to be completely designed, engineered, and manufactured before you can hit your your early market release. All of those things can be done much more cheaply and much more effectively because of 3D printing. So number 5, anatomical. So applications here include, I mentioned anatomical models. So this is taken from the Materialize website. This is actually a benchtop model of a heart, including anatomically appropriate materials for the valve. So it actually has soft valves. And this model is particularly interesting to me because I actually had to order heart models about a decade ago. And at the time, the only really good models we had were glass. And so these were $5,000, $10,000 hand-blown glass models of a single design that we were able to use to do our catheter testing. So before we jumped, it was still a $5,000 model was still a lot cheaper than a full animal trial. So this was our stopgap between routing out a tortuosity path for a catheter in 2D using a chunk of plastic versus jumping into an animal model. We had these models. But now with 3D printing, not only can we get a much cheaper individual model, this allows us to be able to print multiple models. So we can have the average heart size, but we can also look at the minimum and maximum anatomy that we may potentially be dealing with. So it allows us to conduct a lot more expansive testing and to address all the different potential anatomical abnormalities you could deal with for a potential technology, which also means a lot safer devices. Finally, getting into that pilot manufacturing. This is where you need your final materials, your biocompatible materials, either because you need several thousand units for a clinical trial, or because you are such a low volume device that you are really dealing with only a few thousand devices your first year. So this is where, as a manufacturer, I see a lot of amazing value that's been added. So coming up with what was traditionally been called soft or bridge tooling, usually this has been machined out of aluminum before you can go to a hardened steel tool for injection molding or vacuums forms for packaging. But in addition to that, you have things like tech training. I mentioned those several $1,000 early products that you're producing because engineers are building them. Once you get into building your pilot run, now you're dealing with potentially as much of a 50 to 90% scrap rate because you're training your entire team how to build these. Additionally, it's never too early to start producing fixtures and jigs to improve the reliability of your manufacturing. And of course, something that we've been seeing very much in the last 5 years is a lot more direct part manufacturing, to where any kind of tooling really doesn't make sense from a business part. So what you can do is looking at parts that either don't require a high cosmetic finish or don't require a high tolerance. If they're enclosed inside a housing, 3D printing is a very reasonable option for low volume. And by low volume, I mean anything less than 1,000 parts. So a lot of you may be familiar with Stratasys. They came out about 5, 6, even 8 years ago now with a high temperature 3D printable material that was able to use for relatively low pressure injection molding. And so these are some examples of them being able to produce medical device parts made with medical device grade resins. So instead of having to compromise on biocompatibility or being able to create a really rapid tool, using 3D printing to create the tool itself allows you to get the rapid turnaround time you need while still being able to get the biocompatibility and the known quantity of having a commonly used medical device polymer. What you may not have seen is this new update that I saw myself only this last year by a group called Adafab, where they are looking at creating small-scale breakable molds. So the thing about 3D printing a mold using Stratasys' approach is you lose a lot of the value that you get from 3D printing as from geometry. So when you 3D print a mold, you still have to create a part that can follow molding guidelines. What Adafab is doing is they are creating molds that you can literally break off your part. So it's a single-use mold. But what it does is it allows you to keep the geometric complexity that you want out of 3D printing while being able to produce parts in medical grade materials. So for example, you have this very complex spiral structure, but they can put whatever material you want inside that mold. So you could literally fill this with a medical grade resin. You could try this with 6 different kinds of resin. You could use soft silicone. They even have certain metals that they can print into these materials. So they're giving you an incredible amount of flexibility with geometry and with the material choices that you can make by using 3D printing to create their molds. About halfway through here, and on to number 6, we're getting past some of the more common applications you may have seen. And what we're seeing now is clinical training. So this includes what we've seen a lot of, which is patient-specific models that are being used to test for surgeries. But as manufacturers of medical devices, entrepreneurs, this is where you're really thinking about your first in man, thinking about risk reduction, thinking about your clinical trials and doing everything you can to make them successful. So that includes potentially printing patient-specific models for each one of your first couple of patients. This allows you to be able to double check for any heart abnormalities and anatomy abnormalities elsewhere where your product may end up. It allows you to rehearse your procedure. So if you have your physician who is actually going to be doing the case able to practice it multiple times using the new technology and the new techniques before he has to do it on a live patient, that's an incredible opportunity for them. Finally, you can do pre-post anatomical models for proof of efficacy. Being able to show individuals with a tangible object what anatomy looked like before and what it looked like afterward can be an incredible tool to show to investors or to win over new doctors willing to work with your product. Already, this has been seen heavily looking in medical student training. There's been a number of movements who've been looking at trying to replace cadavers, which for different different legal restrictions in certain countries, or for different just cost benefit and business models, medical students are looking at doing more and more training on 3D printing models. From an engineering standpoint, I can actually vouch for this, that in many situations, using 3D printing cadavers may actually be more effective than actual real cadavers. I actually had the opportunity to participate in a number of cadaver classes, and I can vouch for the fact that a lot of the cadavers, their mechanical properties are very different from what you see with living tissue. So what you can do with 3D printing is you can actually more closely simulate what the actual tissue, the flexibility, the elasticity does of a live person than you can with a cadaver that has been preserved. Again, looking at new product training, new technique training, this is looking at expanding. So obviously you may work with just a few positions early on, but eventually you have to think about how are you going to get thousands of doctors trained to use your product and to use your new technique. So you're going to need to be able to come up with simulators to train those teams. Again, we're looking at maybe potentially 10 or 50 or 100 of this product. Creating molds for that custom application is very expensive. Being able to 3D print custom parts, much less expensive. These are some shots from Michigan University, from their Department of Oral Facial Surgery. These are all either medical student test models or looking at patient-specific models that were generated prior to surgery. So again, these aren't just cheap extrusion filament 3D printed parts. These are parts that actually have the right level of consistency of simulating the tissue, especially complex tissue, so dealing with bone and skin and fat layers, and being able to simulate all of those with the anatomy appropriately. So finally, sales. Something that, especially if you are an entrepreneur and you're a very engineering mindset or operation mindset, you may not be thinking about. You have a sales team that eventually is going to have to go out and sell your product. And what you may not realize is that the models that your sales team goes out with a lot of times are not your stocked product. So you find yourself in many ways back to pilot production again. You are now creating custom products that are used for sales demos. This may be because you need to be able to delete a couple of features. It may be that you're adding certain features. It may mean that you need to be able to change the overall geometry. I worked on a number of catheter projects where the final catheter involved being packaged and shipped in a tray that was 72 inches long. Now, imagine your poor Salesforce team jumping on jets, flying around the country with a 72-inch long product. So I've met a number of catheter manufacturers who what they do is they create custom shorties, something that will still deflect, will still move, will still demonstrate all the functions of a catheter, but over a much shorter length. Now, anyone will tell you that those shorties, those demo units, are easily 10 times the price of what they're producing off the general assembly line. So again, creating models, not just shortened or geometrically different, but even being able to come up with, again, anatomy models to showcase your pieces. Instead of walking around with a box of screws, a box of just the implant itself, being able to demonstrate what this looks like on anatomy. And again, not just, middle of the road standard anatomy, but even looking how can you demonstrate to doctors, to hospital administrations, how your product can easily work with abnormal anatomy. So being able to host multiple models showing how your product can be adaptable or modified or is compatible with a wide range of different conditions. So again, the point everyone wants to get to, manufacturing scale up, to where now you are selling in volume. So this is again where large scale manufacturing and large scale assembly, you start realizing this is drawing back the curtain. So looking at things like fit checks for hard tooling. So before you give the okay in the final handoff of hard tooling that your mold manufacturers have produced, can you check that those pilot what you are producing with a mold and what you produced in your pilot production, what you produced early on and is currently out in the marketplace being used by doctors is exactly the same thing that you're going to be getting with your scaled up tooling? Is going to be a major point. Having that consistency across your inventory as you transition is going to be key. Things looking like assembly jigs. A lot of people don't realize how hands-on a lot of assembly processes are. So especially in medical, when our volumes are somewhere between a few thousand, 10,000, or even 100,000, there are still a lot of very hands-on operations where you have techs working on bench assembly lines and being able to speed up their time. Going from 5 pieces an hour to 10 to 20 to 30 pieces an hour is a major cost saving when you can reduce the number of hours of training, hours of hands-on time that you have with your tech team. Again, looking at how can you increase your throughput with your existing tech team or manufacturing team, ergonomic tool modifications. If you have a large-scale mass manufactured tool, a screwdriver, a knife, a razor blade that's used consistently over and over again the same way, think about how you can create a different handle or a different way of using that tool that can allow it to be used quicker, faster, and in a more comfortable hand position for your techs. Again, calibration tests, being able to make sure that your equipment is running and operating consistently. And again, inspection tooling. So not only do you have to think about a team that's on the assembly line, how can you increase the throughput of their pieces that they're generating? You also have to think about your inspection team. You have guys who literally have to inspect potentially 100 parts out of a batch of 1,000 to 10,000 parts, especially early on when you're still dialing in your manufacturing processes. You're going to have a technician inspecting potentially hundreds of parts. So being able to very rapidly take a crucial measurement quickly and consistently is going to be able to be a very valuable application in 3D printing. So just giving you an idea of what I'm talking about. Again, this is what a lot of assembly lines look like in medical device. You have teams of individuals. You do not have robots. Again, and this is just an example of a simple piece of tooling. The white is a 3D printed part created out of a stiff nylon. And you have where you are dropping some pins that are being dropped in. And this whole jig allows you to very quickly and consistently press multiple pins into a part at once. And looking in those applications are not just for small volume, looking at scale up. Most of you are familiar with Invisalign. It's one of the most highly talked about applications of 3D printing at scale in medical. What most of you may know is that the shiny clear plastic part that's shipped to people is not actually what's 3D printed. What is actually 3D printed is the tooling. So basically each patient in Invisalign ends up getting about a dozen different molds that end up shaped, molds meaning the forms that actually shape their teeth into place. And so you have to literally create a dozen custom parts for each individual person that has to be formed over a tool. And so what they do is they 3D print the tool itself, and then a biocompatible medical grade thin sheet of plastic is then vacuum formed over that set of a dozen patient specific vacuum formed molds. And then the pieces are cut out, and then those final dozen pieces that were formed over those 3D printed parts is what's actually gets shipped to your patient. Now, hearing aids are also something that's been done in very high volume. This has been done early on, and this is actually a direct print application. So there are certain applications, including especially in orthopedics, you're seeing a lot as medical 3D printing has expanded, where you are seeing very much patient-specific, custom printed, direct use applications. They are out there. They aren't the most common applications, but as we're seeing expanded use of expanded materials, decreased more efficiencies in 3D printing, we're working out our calibration and how do you test and evaluate custom products. We're going to see it more and more. Finally, another step, number 9, something again not thought about too much. Everyone focuses on getting the product out the door, but for a medical device manufacturer, you have to think about what happens after it gets out the door. This includes things if you're dealing with equipment, if you have large capital equipment that you produce, or you have reusable parts, or you have a product that may potentially you want to be able to upgrade over the life of the part. You have to be able to have the tools to be able to do that quickly and effectively. And since a lot of times servicing and replacement and maintenance, it ends up getting thought of at the very end of a design cycle, you may want to be able to come up with the custom tools to save a lot of time and effort on the part of your service team. And again, looking at training. So training up a service tech on an actual live product that could be sold for profit doesn't make a lot of sense. Usually, just as when you are with dealing with techs who are getting up to speed on inspection, learning about how to manufacture the parts, you don't necessarily want to have them working on goods or inventory that you can actually sell and make money off. So being able to come up with custom trainers to train your service techs very quickly and effectively on how to deal with the most common problems that they may encounter in the field is, again, a great way to use 3D printing. One way I have seen used regularly is the use of 3D printed phantoms. So this is where you really need to be able to come up with a solution that can be the density of the material. Density from a standpoint of how quickly MRI data, X-ray data can transition through a potential application. You want to be able to calibrate your machines. So if you're thinking about using any kind of equipment that is being either used in an MRI, in a CAT machine, in any of these ultrasound, any of these imaging modalities, you want to be able to calibrate it appropriately. And so coming up with this example, an actual phantom that follows the exact shape of a lab rat that's going to be used in an MRI machine needs to be able to, is not a common source. This is something you can't get off the shelf. And so this lab was able to do it. I've seen other examples, especially very common when you are developing new products for breast cancer detection, tumor detection, and other applications. This is where you see a lot more 3D printing coming in. Finally, I'm talking a little fast. Try not to go through slides too quickly. We will leave lots of opportunities for additional questions after this. But what we are looking at left is finally just a number of other applications. So we're seeing a lot of talk about things like resource poor environments, remote manufacturing, but especially we're looking at also things like demand fluctuations. For example, you may find yourself in situations where you think you need to only produce about 1,000 units a year, and suddenly you need to produce 1,500 units a year or 2,000 units a year. And being able to identify how many you need really drives a lot of your economies of scale. And so sometimes we need to find a backup alternative to being able to rapidly produce a large number of parts other than our primary manufacturer. So in these kind of cases, it would actually be very useful if you are in an area where you may see rapid fluctuations in demand. You have a primary manufacturer who is an injection molder that you have approval and oversight from the FDA, but also get approval from manufacturer via a 3D printing manufacturer. This allows you to very quickly switch between the two different manufacturers and to be able to make up for demand fluctuations. This also allows for logistical fluctuations. So not just increases in demand, but if you are dealing with cutoffs in your main supply lines. So you may have manufacturers in other countries that you use primarily for cost methods, but you also want to maintain local resources that you can switch to as necessary. So either changes in demand or changes in your ability to source materials can both drive you to wanting to audit and specify an alternative manufacturer that's a 3D printer. Finally, also looking at recall support. So this is a situation where you discover your product has been in the field and you've now discovered a potential major problem with this part, and you need to resolve it very quickly before you're faced with a massive recall. So what you do here is, again, everything that we talked about before: test apparatus, artificial parts, testing parts for potentially to find a fix or a workaround to deal with a problem. These are all things that can be done much more quickly and much more cost effectively using 3D printing. Now, a number of years ago when I gave this presentation, we talked about resource poor environments. We were talking about things like third world countries. We were talking about things like the Daniel Project, looking at being able to produce and manufacture in areas that were very rural and did not have a lot of manufacturing infrastructure. We also talked about some hospitals. Most of you may not, who if you had some experience with hospital administration, you realize a lot of times they're working with very tight margins. And so things like money and budget for extra equipment or extra resources can lead to really big tie-ups of staff, finding themselves doing very repetitive tasks, where you basically have a very high-paid employee spending lots amount of time doing a repetitive task because you can't afford the basic cost of the equipment. So University of Texas, their medical branch, they actually had this great example of nurses who were given access to a makerspace. And this particular nurse was associated with a burn unit. And so she cited multiple examples where she would spend up to an hour applying a wash routine on a burn unit, where she was basically standing there holding a hose. And all she had to do was 3D print a couple of couples adapters to put some pieces of piping together and to print a 3D print a nozzle. And she was able to be hands off from this patient. This apparatus allowed her to work with 4 or 5 patients at a time instead of being tied up with a single patient. And so again, we've also seen examples in the news of very remote applications, talking about, what would you do for medical emergencies in Antarctica? What would you do with medical emergencies in space? And finally, what else would you do with medical emergencies or even product emergencies out on oil derrick in the middle of the ocean? These are all areas where potentially when you are thrown into, we have to have this part, we have to have this application, and we're nowhere near a manufacturing facility. Where can we use it? And finally, this is the new slide I had to add. Just in the last couple of weeks, in the number of 3D printing applications of equipment, either for direct medical applications or workarounds for dealing with the COVID-19 virus, has exploded all over my LinkedIn feed, my social feed. I've actually written a number of articles now on how can we work with this situation, what to do and what not to do in the way of 3D printing applications. So these are all examples. The top left, we saw examples of an Italian company of 3D printing some of the disposable filters that are a critical part of maintaining infection control in ventilators. Bottom left, one of my local companies, I'm based in this Silicon Valley Bay Area out in California. Carbon 3D printing company was a collaborator creating these swabs for COVID-19 testing. We have many companies that are looking at printing of shields, looking at printing Materialize, has their hand-free door handle opener. And of course, a lot of people have also looked at the snorkel modifications that are being made to allow snorkel masks to be used as ventilator masks via a 3D printed adapter. The actual 3D printed part is the yellow adapter in the top. The scuba mask is the actual mask that's being used. And so again, multiple applications of using 3D printing in a manufacturing resource poor environment, doing logistical challenges, or dealing with very large scale demand scale ups in rapid times. So if you're seeing a lot of 3D printing coming up in your feed as a way of dealing with COVID, that's because those are all examples of ways of dealing with logistics, demand, and remote manufacturing. So a couple of thoughts to ponder. I try to think of myself as a very thoughtful 3D printing fan. So I see a lot of ways it can be used. I see a lot of ways it's being used badly. And I see a lot of ways where it could add a lot of value and it's not being used because people just don't think of it in that way. So I always say right context, right process, and right materials. So right context. I do not believe in 3D printing for the sake of 3D printing. I don't believe in designing or inventing for the purpose of just designing or inventing. So I will always ask myself first, does this thing that I want or need already exist? And then the next closest, easiest thing is, can I modify something that already exists? 3D printing has a really small build volume compared to other manufacturing methods, which means the size of the things I can actually 3D print is somewhat limited, especially if you have a lower end or low cost 3D printing, which means I'm printing adapters, I'm printing small parts. I'm not necessarily printing an entire product. I also think of, can I make this another way more effectively? Right now, we're seeing a lot of masks that are being 3D printed and other masks that are being made with fabric and being sewn. And so a lot of times there are different manufacturing processes that be more effective at handling a particular application than 3D printing. Can I make most of this with a different method? Again, only print what you actually need. And finally, how many of these do I actually need? There's been many ways that traditional injection molding has become a lot more cost effective. And so really, if you're looking at possibly even over 100 parts that you need to work with, you may be able to get molds, and especially rapid prototyping mold, as quickly and efficiently and cost effectively as you could if you 3D printed those parts. Finally, right process. I mentioned before, 3D printing is not just one process. It's a whole umbrella term that covers many different processes. And each one of those processes has a number of different design limitations. Before you think about using any particular 3D printing application, you really need to look at their design specifications for that process and for the machine that you'll be using, because each one of them has limits. How big will this be? You need to know your build volume. How precise does it need to be? What kind of tolerances can you get with this particular application? And all these other questions. Do you have mechanical properties? Does it need to be tough, flexible, shatter resistant? Do I need multiple materials? If you're trying to recreate a two-shot mold, for example, you want a rubber grip around a plastic part, there are 3D printers that can do that, but only certain kinds of 3D printers can do that. Those same ones can look at graduated materials. So this is where you're actually seeing something that can't be done with traditional manufacturing, where you have a stiff part on one end and a flexible part on the other. And finally, how much post-processing can I work with? Some of these processes, they have an insane amount of post-processing time. If you're working in metal processes, a lot of times the supports that are generated in metal can take 5 to 6 times as long to grind off, polish, and remove as it takes to actually produce the 3D printed part itself. So really think about how much, if you need something that you can take right off the machine and start using, that's going to limit you to a certain number of processes. And finally, looking at right materials. This is something that needs to be considered regardless of what process you use to create a medical device. So questions like, does it need to be waterproof? Again, this actually also occurs to right process. I see a number of people trying to use filament-based, kind of MakerBot type 3D printers on something that they want to be airproof, waterproof, or gasproof. And you realize a lot of those, there's a lot of potential leaks depending on how clean and well calibrated your machine is. Will it spend a lot of time in the sun? If you're using any process that uses light to cure the product, you're dealing with a photosensitive material. So these are materials that you don't necessarily want to use outside. You don't want to, print components to put together sprinkler adapters using a light-based product. Will it get dirty? A lot of 3D printers, they create highly porous parts. It's very difficult to get a perfectly smooth mirror polish on a 3D printed part, which means it can be very difficult to clean. It will absorb oil, it'll absorb dirt, and it'll be very difficult to get that off again. Will it get dropped? And this occurs and you should pretty much apply this to anything that is used in the hand and is not directly strapped down to something. Whether this is a cell phone case, a surgical tool that you want to get used again, you need to be able to pick a material that can get dropped. A lot of the early stage materials we used in prototyping in SLA were notorious for being very brittle. You were very careful. If you only had 2 or 3 prototypes, you were very careful not to drop them because they would shatter if you dropped it. Will it spend a lot of time against the skin? Again, cautioning to any light-based materials, light-based processes that produce the 3D printed part. A lot of the light-based processes, the mechanism that transitions that chemical from a liquid to a solid, a lot of times generates different acid byproducts. Most of them get used fully up when you cure it, but sometimes there may additionally be a slight tendency towards more acidic. So you have to be very careful that if you are using a 3D printed material, it's been tested for skin contact for a certain amount of time. May not necessarily need to be implant grade, but at least 30-day contact. Again, how hot will it get? I mentioned before, only in the last few years have we seen autoclavable 3D printed materials. And so there are a limited number of processes that can produce parts that can get heated up to either boiling point or even heated up to the point that for a cauterization tool or even used safely with electronics. Will it rub against other materials? What kind of materials? Thinking about friction, thinking about potentially being sticky motion. Most SLA materials are still not that great because you can't get a good surface finish for rubbing and being used against mechanical parts. So if you do 3D print a part, it's very nice if you can get a large scale manufactured part for it to interface with. So at least you have a smooth surface on one of your 2 rubbing parts. Again, does it need to be transparent? Will it be painted? Does it need to flex or bend? All of these things that eventually will drive your choice on whether or not this is the right material. So I will be sending out this webinar. It's going to be recorded. This last slide is the one point that I want to drive home. For you guys to be able to think critically about the context, the process, and the materials before you start thinking about how am I going to use 3D printing in my process. So that's the end of my actual presentation. I ran 2 minutes over, I think, what we originally hoped to, but that's my name, that is my email. I'm very welcome to take questions. Either connect with me afterwards on LinkedIn, or you can check out my website at www.dyadengineering.com. I regularly blog on the site about different topics having to do with design, 3D printing, manufacturing, and new technologies in the medical space. So I can open that up for questions. And do we have any in the chat at this time?
Kate, first of all, I want to thank you so much for an incredibly engaging and informative presentation. And we had a number of questions come in during your presentation before we got to sort of the next to last slide, I think, about 3D printing applications and the COVID-19 response. No surprise there, since it's the topic at the forefront of everyone's minds at this juncture. And you have definitely addressed the bulk of those questions, but do want to ask you, for individuals and organizations looking to potentially get involved in the 3D printing response or learn more about those applications, would you encourage them to check out the NIH Print Exchange? Are there other resources you might recommend?
Okay, well, I always want to recommend that last slide I mentioned first. if you are thinking about 3D printing any particular product, you ought to ask the first question, is there an alternative available that would be better? And, in some places there are still masks and they need to use those first. So where we're seeing 3D printing is really where there is no better option. And I want to reiterate that. It's something that's been reiterated on the FDA side as well, because they've actually recently did a really quick response to all of the 3D printing of masks, ventilator components, different parts that have come out. And the emphasis is still use what has been mass manufactured, as if at all possible. Not necessarily because it's the best design, but because all the risk of using that product has been worked out. So, risk looking at the material selection, risk in looking at inconsistent manufacturing, risk in looking at contaminants. So we've seen a number of warnings that are starting to come out of these 3D printed products that aren't being handled properly. So they're actually being contaminated before being sent out to the groups that need them. So if you are going to do 3D printing, you need to make sure that you're doing it in a way that de-risks the process as much as the existing product you're used to. One thing I always want to caution people who are getting into the medical device field for the first time is to realize that your end users are not you. What you have is you have practitioners who are using products that they generally have never questioned the safety or the efficacy of the products they're using. They're used to, if they see something that's in a sealed package, they're going to assume it's sterile. If they see something that looks like a medical device, they're going to assume it's going to operate like a medical device. Because those of us in our industry, and that's the way it should be, those of us in our industry, if we do our job right, the people who use our products never have to question whether or not they're safe. On the other hand, if you have individuals who don't come from that background and that way of thinking, now you have clinicians who they're going to have a lot of assumptions about the products that they're using that may not hold true anymore. They may have to take a much more involved role in checking, does this design really work? What do I need to do to use this product safely? How do I sterilize this myself properly? Those are things that healthcare providers have to think about now that they didn't have to before. And so if you are going to look at providing this medical device, be aware of that you are taking on the responsibility of the risk of any kind of risk that may happen with this product. So, but if you are getting the situations, and I'm totally aware that there are people out there that are at the end of their rope, and this really is better than nothing. I went and actually created a whole blog post on my website, and I don't want to put in a plug for my website, but there are so many issues that are associated with this that I had to write up an article that covers so many of them. And again, it starts off with a lot of the basics of being aware and being smart about what you're printing and thinking of other challenges besides the actual manufacturer, whether it's logistics, whether it's distribution that may be affecting your availability. But if you are looking at 3D printing, looking at things like finding a good design that's been validated. We're not necessarily reinventing. And this week I am looking at sourcing and analyzing all the existing designs out there to see what I can recommend. I haven't had the chance to do that yet, and I know that there are dozens of designs out there. But there are some that are being generated by individuals who have manufactured them multiple times and can provide details on how to manufacture these safely. So one, find a good design. Two is going to be, come up with a manufacturing process that's repeatable and reliable. So that includes things like being able to modify your particular design for your particular machine and material. I mentioned earlier design guides. If you go to your 3D printers, the manufacturer of your actual machine site, they will have guidelines on best practice on how to use your machine. This includes things like calibration cycles, maintenance. These are things that every manufacturer does in medical device. We have to make sure our equipment is appropriately calibrated. We have to make sure it's clean. We have to make sure that we check it for every single lot that we produce of medical materials. After that, you're looking at your materials. Every material that's manufactured has a best effort design guide. Whether you are SLA printing something, whether you're using a inkjet or a object printer, whether you're using a sintered-based method, there are guidelines about how thick of a wall you can use, how small of a feature, what kind of tolerances, and along what axis of use is the best way to orient your parts to get the best manufacture out of your part. So you're going to have to find a right design, modify that design to make sure it works properly with your material and your machine. And then when you do manufacture it, you need to make sure that you do a number of test runs, preferably with just one part, until you've made sure that what's coming off that machine will actually work like it's supposed to. So some of that testing may involve coming up with some basic stress testing to where you're pounding on that part, you are dunking it and scrubbing it in different sterilizing solutions. You're trying to put, you're wearing it around the lab on your face for 12 hours. Highly recommend that. I'm seeing a lot of bruising and even pressure sores on the faces of a number of these doctors and practitioners. So make sure that you are coming up with a mask that they can wear safely and comfortably for as long as possible. So I know time is short, but all of these are things that can be done in an hour or two. So definitely stress test your product before you put it out the door, before you put it in the hands of a doctor. And even then, maintain some traceability. Traceability is the other unspoken secret of medical device manufacturing. Everything that goes out the door, we know where it ended up. And if wherever it ends up, if there's a problem, we can trace it back to exactly what lot and what day it was manufactured. So if you are going to be producing product that's going to go out into the field, that doctors are going to be able to use, please put something on it that allows you to trace it. Either a date, a lot number, a manufactured by Ed at this address that allows them to go back to you if they have a problem with that product. You want to have a full closed loop, that if they have this product that they are using and it fails in some way, or even to be able to call them up and say, hey, we shipped you this device 4 weeks ago and we never intended anybody to use it for more than a week. To be able to say, can you please dispose of those? We'll send you a fresh batch. You never want to end up having a product go someplace you didn't intend it to go and be used in a way it wasn't intended to be used. So that is my short 5-minute sermon on emergency 3D printing of medical product. Again, go to my blog, hook up with me on LinkedIn. I've tried to get much more expanded in detail, ideas, warnings, best tips of how to go about dealing with this very unusual and short-term situation. But are there any other questions in general about 3D printing and the whole process of medical device development?
Kate, thank you so much for expanding on that. And on behalf of THPD, I can assure you that we will definitely be visiting the blog. I'm scrolling through the rest of our questions for today.
Hey, Kate, this is Tammy. Can you hear me?
Yes, I
Yeah,
can.
Tammy, we can hear you.
Kate, I just want to tell you thank you so much. This was fantastic. Exactly what we all needed to hear. And thank you for that last little bit regarding the face masks. And it's a brilliant idea to wear it for 8 hours. And we're going to put that in our queue as we speak. So thank you again. And I would encourage everyone who's listening to use Kate as a resource. She's got a lot of good information to share with you. Thank you again, Kate. Stay safe.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that. It's a strange thing. I actually did I looked at 3D printing and non-traditional innovators as part of my PhD thesis. Who knew that in 3 years it would be the exact topic that needed to be studied? So, I'm just grateful to have the opportunity to share that resource.
Well, we are extremely appreciative. And as Kate mentioned at the beginning of today's program, we'll have a recording of today's webinar available on the THPD. Sorry, I hope you can hear me.
It sounds like we lost mute. I can hear you now.
Okay, thanks. Just wanted to reiterate that we will have the recording of today's program on the THPD website and YouTube channel available shortly. And Kate, want to thank you so much for your partnership and for sharing a wealth of information with us today.
All right, you're all very welcome. Please stay safe. Keep the people you're trying to help safe as well.
Thanks so much, and same to you. Take care.
All right.